Hello, welcome to the Critical Practices Talks. I am Carolina Rito. I am Professor of Creative Practice Research at the Center for Arts, Memory and Communities at Coventry University. And today I have with me Doreen Mende, who will be also in conversation about critical practices and other topics that we will be shortly introducing. So this series of monthly conversations shed light on the capacities of practice to produce knowledge, advance critical inquiries, and intervene in society. I have hosted conversations with researchers and practitioners in the fields of art, curating, critical theory, and museum studies. And as I said, today we have Doreen Mende to continue our conversations on critical practices and curatorial practices. Doreen Mende is a curator, writer, and theorist, and currently associate professor for curatorial politics and head of the CCC, that stands for Critical Curatorial Cybernetics, research-based master and PhD forum at University of Art and Design, head in Geneva, Switzerland. The most recent curatorial projects include Hidden Labor Across Internaute 1 at Kunstverein Leipzig, collaboration with Bauhaus Imaginista at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, also House of the Cultures of the World in Berlin, Paul Klee Zentrum in Bern, and Salt in Istanbul. Equally, Mende has collaborated with the Dutch Art Institute, with Khalil Sakakini Cultural Center for the Sharjah Biennial in Ramallah, and she's principal investigator of Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism, which is a research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, started in 2019 and will run until 2024. And me and Doreen will have a chance to talk a bit more about this project in this conversation. Mende is author of academic, essayistic, and experimental writings on the geopolitics of exhibition making, internationalism, archival metabolism, and visual regimes. These publications have been published in the Oxford Handbook of Communist Visual Cultures, Efflux Journal, MIT Press, Sternberg Press, and others. Mende, who holds a PhD in visual cultures from Goldsmiths and University of London, is also a member of the European Forum for Advanced Practices. And since 2015, she's a founding member of the Arun Faraki Institute in Berlin. So once more, welcome, Doreen. Thank you so much for joining me here at the Critical Practices Talks. I've been looking forward for this conversation, and one of the reasons is because of the coincidence, let's say, of the use of the term critical in the program you are directing in Geneva, in Switzerland, and also the topic of these the conversations, critical practices. So the term critical, it's something that is being definitely one of the main concerns, let's say, of these conversations, but also what the critical practices strands at the center in Coventry has been preoccupied with. And I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of what you see being the role of critique today. And just as a kind of a backdrop to this question, I would like just to mention, let's say, two facts, or at least 2 points that are definitely present when we today, in 2021, I think, use this term. One of them would come from the critique of critique. I guess after the linguistic turn, after post-structuralism, but also with new materialism discourses and debates, we see critique being criticized, or critiqued, better said, being critiqued for not being able to go beyond debunking reality and not being able to compose, as Bruno Latour, for instance, would say, to compose reality, or in other terms, to be a more propositional tool. So this is one of the things that we have as part of, I guess, when we utter or when we use this term, we definitely have in mind. The other side, or the other aspect that also I think is equally important, is to understand, and I guess they probably speak to each other, these two elements, but something we can discuss further, is also what is happening in academia, particularly in the arts and humanities field, where we see that disciplines that are more speculative, more critical, have been in a way under attack with the systematization of knowledge production. And what I mean here is with areas that have been stressed or valued, areas that trade in evidence and facts, but are also more suitable for the metrics driven evaluation. And so those disciplines tend to be stressed over, again, more speculative and more critical disciplines. And so we have kind of these two, I would say, fronts, or these two preoccupations, I guess, when operating in the field. So it strikes me that CCC has been so keen to use the term critical, juxtaposed obviously to curatorial and cybernetics. But I wanted to, again, go back to my question and ask you, how do you see the role of critique today? And if we can see critique as being also propositional against the critiques that we see coming from other fields?
Thank you so much, Carolina, also for having me in the round of conversations. It's a pleasure to think with you and to continue also a conversation that we started many years ago with curatorial knowledge, which I think also plays a critical part in the investigation of what is critique today. Let me maybe start more from a transgenerational kind of perspective, because the CCC, the Critical Curatorial Cybernetic Research Program that I run in Geneva, has been initiated in the 90s and exists as the program as it is as a master program since 2005, was named in the moment when the Bologna process was imposing the kind of categorization and numerologization also of study and art education. And the founder, Catherine Quillot, participated in the Wittner Independent Study Program in the 70s, early 80s, where this notion of critique, of course, has been like extremely important to form an understanding of institutional critique informed by feminist methodologies, by analytical methodologies, sociological methodologies, where the analysis of the structural composition of the situation or the environment in which we operate has been profoundly kind of unsettled, but also analyzed in order to understand those power relations. So Hans Hake, Adrian Piper, Mary Kelly, Yvonne Rainer are very important transgenerational interlocutors in that regard. And this has been very important for me. I'm saying this because I think it's important to think in a transgenerational kind of constellation. But at the same time, while I was studying this in my own studies as a student, I was mesmerized with the work of, for example, Andrea Fraser, who is so much kind of formative for this analytical engagement of the institutional framework as a composite of power and also a history of power from this critical perspective. And I was very mesmerized. And then at some point I realized, it was a kind of a crisis and also a shock, how this kind of analytical approach to critique is extremely important to reveal existing structural compositions, superstructures, or the interpellation also of the subject through power positions and power compositions, role plays, etc. But in my research, or also then, and the work with the students who bring in perspectives and also sets of knowledges from tricontinental trajectories, opposing a Eurocentric and also North American understanding of how infrastructures and institutions are supposed to operate, also with regard to our understanding of critique, where I think the critical needs to be much more, and this is what we rehearse continuously also with our students, to be unpacked, to be expanded, to be stretched open, and decentered and learned from its imperative of analysis only. What I'm trying to say is maybe not so much, I mean, of course, speculation in terms of a critical fabulation, as Saidiya Hartman has proposed us to think with regard to the violent absences in the archive, for example. So what do you do if narratives are fully excluded from a structural entity by definition and by violence in the first place? So you cannot really do anything with this kind of critical methodologies to analyze structures except of stating once more the violence. So I think the era we are living in, and this has been very important also for my work in my own research, is to find methodologies that allow us to find vocabularies, methodologies, narratives that allow us to speak about these absences or to fabulate about these absences, to embody these absences, to sing, to perform, to be affected by these absences as practice. So I would maybe, to conclude this, say that this question of critique, this is very much also in the thinking with Denise Ferreira Silva, who has developed this idea of poetical reading, to shift this kind of understanding of critique or critical practice or criticality more towards the question of being affected, of affective kind of encounters, to kind of open up the possibility of experimentation and fiction, theory, speculation as a way to embark on knowledge production.
It sounds to me that the very debate, I guess, or even conundrum that there is in the politics of the archive, as you were talking about through the work of Saidiya Hartman, and how that question around, is it about completeness? Is it about completing the incomplete archive and the obvious absences, or is it about inhabiting the absence and what that space would tell more in terms, not more about the mechanisms of archive making than necessarily about engaging with the same mechanisms to complete it. And I think this is also always this tension that I think we see going on in the field of contemporary art, as we know, but also curating. So I'm interested in those methodologies, Doreen, and I think you mentioned now in your answer also some of them, speculation, fiction. So how to inhabit precisely those critical arenas, I guess. And we see in your practice also the opening up to, for short now, I would say, opening up to other cultural products or other cultural instances that are beyond exhibition making. And we see that happening through publications, we see that happening through educational formats, we see that happening through other means. So I wanted to know a bit more about how you see those curatorial methodologies, but specifically in relation to something that I see with a lot of enthusiasm and curiosity, which is the use of the term politics that you've been juxtaposing to curatorial. So we see that, for instance, in your job title in terms of associate professorship, but we also see in your project more and more curatorial slash politics, if I'm quoting it correctly. I think I am. So I'm curious to understand what is the tension you are creating by juxtaposing those two terms.
the introduction of the constellation of the curatorial with politics came out from a necessity and an urgency, whereas the practice that we engage with is a composite of practices, is a form of research, is a form of engagement, and also of forms of collaborations. So what was necessary for me is to understand, it comes a bit back to that what we discussed earlier, to extend the question of knowledge. I mean, of course, the curatorial knowledge also resonates. It's kind of a continuation of that thought. The curatorial politics is a continuation of curatorial knowledge. Yet, what I saw in my own practice, that this question of knowledge in the field we are working in is continuously under danger. It's a political field, let's say. And since knowledge is so kind of desirable and requested forms of new knowledge, the question of the new, which Ariella Aisha Soleil continuously also kind of reflects as an imperative of modernity that always seeks for the new, of new knowledges, of archival finds, of undiscovered narratives, where I think the exhibitionary complex is the paradigm of exposing and valorizing this question or the figure of knowledge as a kind of a value system. And I wanted to do something that would challenge this kind of composite of the curatorial with knowledge, though I'm totally embedded, of course, to knowledge, of course. But I wanted to put more emphasis on that curatorial as a field, as we have been discussing this for so many years in the PhD program that we shared at Goldsmiths, to understand this as a field in which gathering, commoning, organizing, but also politicizing is at stake. So I think in the era we are living in, this critical moment of a planetary crisis, let it be the political kind of situation of what of the global swing to the right that we see in India for many years now, and in the US, and tendencies in East Germany. I mean, this is what affects me quite a bit. But also the whole climate situation condition, artificial intelligence, algorithmic cultures. We are living in a pretty kind of challenging and transformative time where I think knowledge is not enough to engage with. I think we have an accountability, again, from a transgenerational and transhistorical perspective, to to mobilize the political. And I don't want so much to promote this kind of notion of politics here as marching on the street or as political organization, but rather the political in its kind of notion of the forum as a polis kind of where people gather, forms of organization take place, exchange takes place. And this is also where I really would like to situate the exhibition as a political space. Because, I mean, we all know that exhibiting is a political act. It creates histories, it frames narratives, it constitutes archives, it constitutes institutional kind of also value. And I mean, the whole value system that comes with that, where I think we have to hold on to that capacity. It's very important as a cultural, epistemological, social tool. Yet I think the question of the political is an important one in the very moment we are living in, when we have just gone through all of the questions and need for thinking, what does abolition mean in the in this moment when we think about how to undo the structural inequalities, racism, and gender kind of gaps. How do we engage in that? And this is where the political comes in as a practice from a position of a curator, of a thinker, of an intellectual, of a woman that sits in the network also and in the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in a way, that space of politics would necessarily be a situated one in relation to what you also mentioned before, of those conditions that inform, I wouldn't say subjectivity really, but inform the capacity to operate, be it as a curator or as a woman, etc. So the variety constellation of those elements. You mentioned exhibition, and you mentioned as being also a cultural tool, epistemological and cultural tool. I think that these were the terms you used. And just as a very quick question, really. As we know, exhibitions imply a physical presence. We are currently in lockdown where I am in UK today, and you will be under certain restrictions as well where you are. These necessarily impact and has a massive effects and in what we have been accustomed to as traditional cultural products and the fruition of those products, which would be an exhibition space, for instance, and us navigating that space, and necessarily those things currently are not possible. What do you think, not necessarily in relation to the exhibition format only, but in terms of the practices that you just described, what are the challenges now? And I don't ask these, Doreen, as to a question that expects a sort of a list of solutions, but just a bit of your thoughts so far, because it's been almost a year under these new conditions. How is it affecting? What are the main challenges?
Yes, maybe just also what, just to connect to one element is this kind of the question of the curatory as a cultural tool, but also as a tool of making. It's an art-led making. Let's also not forget at all that, I mean, the potency and also the political potency in terms of methodologies we engage with are very much informed and have to be informed by a continuous kind of conversation with art-led practices and art-led thinking, which might bring me maybe to this concern that you bring up with regard the tele-technological imperative we are living in and through by the corona planetary crisis. It's a shifting ground that we are inhabiting at this very moment. Last year, I did a seminar with the curatorial politics students on exactly this question, and it just came, the pandemic just came into the conversation in the middle of it regarding artistic internationalism by the means or in relation to questions of technology. The kind of relationality or connectivities on a planetary scale has been again politically formative and important in the second part of the 20th century when we think about movements of internationalism, of filmmakers in Latin America supporting struggles of Palestine. The non-aligned movement was a political and revolutionary sequence that was profoundly composed by an entanglement of disengagement with the global binary order. So what I'm trying to say is I'm very fascinated by the capacities and also methodologies to think how could we articulate this relationality and connectivity that we, for instance, now inhabit, you and me, by being in conversation and trying to think some things through and to name the situation we are in. McKinsey Walk has published a book in 2012 that is all around the question of telesthesia, the perception at distance that is continuously navigated and organized through interfaces. And sure think it will have an impact, and it will have it is a pharmakon for sure. It's kind of a poison And, you know, we would love to be in close contact, physical touch with people that we want to think with in a social kind of also imaginary. This is very important. And at the same time, it allows to be in conversation across long distances that has been rehearsed, you know, by artists and activists and revolutionaries for decades in geographies that are not necessarily in the kind of so-called centers of activity. So, you know, I mean, I think it is worth to shift a bit the perspective on the kind of the burden, while at the same time, surely we have to think, what is the social imaginary? What does the social imaginary look like regarding education, regarding intellectual exchange and knowledge processing under these conditions? Yet, I think to attach this to the question of the techne and what I mean, what I'm working on now and continue to work is a note on the new international Bhagavati Chakraborty Spivak, where she introduces the notion of telepoesia, the making in distance, the making that sits inside of a relation, of a connectivity navigated below institutional frameworks, but, you know, fabricated and lubricated by techno-political kind of infrastructure. And we have to take responsibility on that.
The kind of conversations and cultural and social imaginaries that probably this pandemic is allowing through the technique. So I think it's a very interesting kind of juxtaposition, and thank you for that. Quite inspiring, I think, and quite inspiring take on the current conditions. So finally, Doreen, I have a final question that is very much related to your, I wouldn't say latest project, because it's something that you're still working on, Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism. So you started in 2019, is currently supported by the Research Council in Switzerland. Do you want to give us an overview and also some hints of where the project is going?
Sure, thank you. So you see in the background work by Arti Sunda, We Owe Each Other Everything, is a work that Arti developed for the first curatorial iteration of Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism, that engages in the question of the invisibilization of labor, but also the extreme individualization of labor for contract workers from India. For example, in Saudi Arabia is like one case study that Arti is engaging in that work, that we discussed in relation to the double invisibilization of what we live through at the moment. I mean, what we live now through regarding the visibility of the worker and of internationalism, because since 1989, 1990, this idea of a geopolitical alliance that would propose a kind of a post-capitalistic kind of future has also been pretty kind of invisibilized, let's say. I wouldn't say it has totally disappeared. We have microhistories and embodied archives and silences and blind spots and transgenerational also kind of transmissions and politics of memory, etc. But this is something that we engage with in Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism. It's a team. We are a team of a doctoral researcher and a collaborator, and many collaborators also with the House of the World Cultures, Van Abbe Museum, Kunstverein in Leipzig. I'm saying this because it's a scientific research project as it started in terms of, you know, the funding. Yet the experimentation and the art-led kind of case studies are very, very important regarding the politics of knowledge, because it tries to find methodologies not only just to celebrate an archival find, let's say, Vinit Agarwal, our collaborator, has worked in this project on the Indian filmmaker Chetna Vora, who studied in East Germany in Potsdam in the 80s. And, you know, it's really amazing kind of history that is, I mean, she doesn't even have a Wikipedia entry. Yet instead of just, you know, we celebrate her work of Chetna Vora, but what we also try to do by decolonizing socialism is to ask the question of what does it mean to look into these microhistories that sits in also a quite kind of dominant or, you know, macro political infrastructure of a state socialist construction. What does it mean to engage in this kind of ambivalent composite 40 years later in a totally different political system, and also in a context of a political economy of exhibiting that just waits for these kind of uncoverings? And this is where the decolonizing comes in. Once with regard to, I mean, you know, the state socialist horizon and problematics. I mean, the East Germany was a dictatorial decisionist state. And, but at the same time, you have all these sets of practices that operated in an emancipatory way and were challenging also this kind of global order of you know, capitalistic imperative. But the decolonizing also comes in with regard to the methodology of our research itself. So this concerns with our practice that we want to commit ourselves in a criticality, you could say, but also in a way, how could we expose those narratives in an academic sense, but also with regard to the kind of exhibiting practice in the field of contemporary art. We plan to have several exhibitions. One is going to take place, a research display being exposed, being part of a project of the House of the World Cultures. The title of that is The Mist Seminar, World Making After Internationalism. And Lea Marie-Nienhoff is working on a different case study. I mean, step by step, but we have quite a large group of already grown a very beautiful community of advisors, collaborators, artists.
Well, definitely a lot to look forward to. Thank you so much for talking us through, well, the main drivers of CCC program in Geneva, but also your curatorial practice, the methodologies that brings about as well, and also the way in which you've been now committed to the Decolonizing Socialism research project. We definitely, as I said, look forward to the development of the project. Thank you so much again, Doreen, for your time and for the very entertaining conversation.
Thank you so much, Carolina. I enjoyed it very much. To be continued. Thank you.